able to see all of you while this presentation is happening. So my apologies for that. Uh, so the the union budget of 24-25, of course, that has been presented is different from the normal budgets for the reason that it is an interim budget or a vote on account. Mainly, when a budget is presented, it includes proposals about resource mobilization by the government and plans for expenditure. Well, of course, there are figures in the budget for this 24-25 also present in the budget, but really most of the proposals that would be applicable for the financial year 24-25, which begins only on 1st of April, will be decided by whichever government comes after the elections in May. And general elections in May, and there'll be a new parliament and a new legislature where the final budget for 24-25 will be actually presented. So as of now, the union budget for 24-25 is simply extending what is the pattern that you already have. No significant new taxes have been proposed. Essentially, some of the tax concessions that were lapsing by 31st March have been extended so as to cover the period till the elections are over. And no significant changes have been made as far as the expenditure side is concerned. So that's the way it would be. Normally, an interim budget presented just before an election is not a budget where any significant new proposals are introduced. Last time, when before the 2019 general elections, that pattern was kind of broken a little because the scheme of giving financial support to farmers, monthly payment to farmers of 500 rupees, was actually introduced just before the elections in this budget. And soon enough, of course, the elections will be notified and the model code of conduct will come into force, and you can't really make any announcements after that. This time there has been no departure from that norm, so no new significant announcements have been made in the 24-25 budget. But when the budget is presented, you also include figures for the how the last year has turned out relative to what was proposed at the beginning of the year when the budget was presented in 23. So those figures also we have, and these figures along with them, what they are actually describing is or capturing is if you look at the term of the present government, this 23-24 represents the final financial year within the term of the government, in which quite at the beginning you had a significant shock to the economy in the form of the COVID pandemic and the response to it. So really much of the term of the present government has been dominated by the COVID pandemic and the effects of that. If you go back to 2019-20, which is the first year, 2019 was the elections, and 2019 again a final budget was presented. That 2019-20 year was also a year in which there was a lot of talk about an economic slowdown having emerged in the Indian economy. And that was soon followed by the COVID pandemic. So whose effects were then, significant effects have been felt in the economy throughout. So what I thought I would do in this discussion today is to present a picture of what has happened over this period through the lens of what has happened to central government's revenues and expenditures up to the present, and suggest that what has actually happened, what we have witnessed in the last 4 or 5 years, is there is a slogan that is used, Aapada mein Avsar, which is making an opportunity out of a crisis. So it seems that a crisis of the Indian economy has been made into an opportunity for what I am calling the great reset of the Indian economy. And that's what you will find is reflected in what's happening to government's finances, government expenditure, where government's fiscal policy approach has also been an instrument of that process of reset. So let me try and explain what that reset is through the discussion about what has happened to expenditures and receipts. So if one looks at the GDP at current prices, so in this particular table, the top half is just indices of the nominal figures of GDP at current prices, revenues of the state, and expenditures by the government. Okay, so if you look at GDP at current prices, what this is telling you is that from 2019-20 to 2023-24, okay, over that 4-year period, of which begins, so if you look at the pre-COVID period up till the last year, which is now ending in March, which is going to end in March on the March 31st, 2024. If you take into account the first advanced estimates for GDP, then in nominal terms, GDP at current prices in 23-24 is 47.5% higher than in 2019-20. Okay, you can see that in 2021 there was a drop, and then there is a supposed recovery, but these are for nominal GDP. This is not real GDP. Please keep in mind. So nominal GDP has increased by 47.5%. But if one looks at the revenues of the government from central taxes, you find that the increase, if you take the revised figures, the increase is compared to 2019-20, 71%. That is, revenues of the government have increased at a faster rate over that entire period than GDP itself has done. Okay, so a higher proportion of GDP has come to the government in the form of revenues. Okay. In this, both the state governments and the central government has shared. Okay. But if you look at the net figure to the center, that has also gone up by over 71%. Okay. 71% increase in revenues, in tax revenues. And if you look at all revenue receipts, including non-tax revenues, they have gone up by 60%. Okay. So 60% is the increase in revenues of the government between 2019 and 2023-24. Compared to that, the increase in expenditure is 67%. Okay. So it is not that in this period of the COVID pandemic, the post-pandemic period, you have had expenditures being made in excess of revenues. So despite the COVID pandemic, it does not appear that the central government and the state governments are fiscally severely constrained on account of the pandemic. It's a rather odd result, but if you just compare the increase in GDP at current prices with what has happened to revenue receipts and expenditure, you can see that both the receipts from the government as well as the expenditures of the government have increased over the entire period faster. Okay, but expenditures have not, in a sense, significantly outpaced revenues. Okay. If despite this, there is a so-called problem of the fiscal deficit, which still remains to be addressed, that's because the denominator in the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, which is GDP at current prices, that has not kept pace with revenues and expenditure. The second component of so if you see, for example, as a percentage of GDP, which is at the bottom, you can see tax revenues as a percentage of GDP are higher. Expenditure is higher than in 2019-20, but lower than in 2020-21, which was the immediate year of the pandemic, the lockdown, etc., and everything. Okay, that's not because expenditure went haywire. but basically because the denominator, the GDP itself, dropped significantly that year. That's why that ratio goes up. Okay. So you see that there is, if you look at both as percentage of GDP as well as the indices, and you see the percentage change, there is absolutely no reason to presume that there has been some spending splurge that has happened unmatched by revenues. So what you normally expect, that the pandemic would be a situation which demands additional expenditure from the state, while at the same time the disruption of economic activity reduces the capacity of the state to generate revenues. That doesn't seem to have happened except very temporarily. Okay. And that's related, as I shall try and demonstrate, to this great reset that I'm talking about. Okay. So central expenditure, if you see, as a percentage of GDP, went up in 2020-21, but since then has been continuously brought down. While tax revenues of the state, including the net position of the center, that has been improving. So the fiscal deficit, in a sense, should have been coming down, but simply because the GDP growth nominal GDP has not grown that much, you have still as a ratio of GDP, the ratio is high. But it is not a result of expenditures outstripping actually revenues. That's the key point to be understood. The second point, you can see, important element, which is much talked about, is that not only has there been the stepping up of expenditure, but there's a change in the pattern of that expenditure. So if you look at revenue expenditure, that has not gone up so much. But what is considered the more productive form of government expenditure, which is capital expenditure, that has increased dramatically. It is almost 3 times the level that was it in 2019-20. And as a percentage of GDP, revenue expenditure is already back to the levels of 2019-20. It is capital expenditure which has gone up from 1.7% of GDP to 3.2% of GDP. Okay. So the contention is that, in a sense, the fiscal response to the COVID pandemic has been marked by everything being right. Expenditures have not gone haywire. They have remained within limits set by revenues. And within the expenditure, there is a shift towards the more productive forms, which is capital expenditure. That is the way it appears when you look at it at first sight. Okay. Now, let us look at the growth question itself. Okay. So, this nominal 47.5% we are seeing, of course, is since 2019-20. But if we saw 2022-23 compared to 2019-20 and compared it with similar 3-year periods previously, then you can see that there is a clear trend where in the increase in nominal GDP, the part which is due to real growth and the part which is due to simply increases in prices, in the balance between them, there was a trend of shift towards increase in prices. And the post-COVID pandemic effect on the economy was a contraction in the increase in real GDP over the same 3-year period, while a significantly higher rate of increase in prices. Okay. So this is based on what is there in the GDP figures in terms of at constant and current prices. We know that the rate of growth of nominal GDP is the sum of the rate of growth of real GDP plus the rate of inflation. So the rate of inflation, which are the red bars here, were showing a tendency to go up, while the blue bars, which are the rate of growth of real GDP, were tending to come down, and the COVID pandemic clearly aggravated that particular trend. Okay. So that's what you see if you see the first 3 sets of bars. But if you look at the last one, which is 2023-24 over 22-23, there seems to be a significant reversal. If you look at the nominal rate of growth of GDP in 2023-24, it is actually quite low at 8.9%. The real growth of 7.3% is coming because it appears that the rate of inflation has suddenly dropped from 8 to 9% in the previous year to 1.5% in 23-24. Okay. It's only because that rate of growth, the rate of inflation is forming the basis for the determination of real growth, that you're getting the 7.3% real growth. If the rate of inflation instead of 1.5 was 5.5, which is the level that the consumer price index is showing, then that same rate of growth, which is showing 7.3%, would become 3.3%, because another 4% would have to be transferred to the inflation account if the inflation rate was actually 5.5% rather than 7.3%. So the real growth of 23-24, which is talked about as India being the bright spot in the world economy, uh, may in part be somewhat of a statistical illusion that is resulting from the fact that there have been sharp fluctuations in international prices, which affect the wholesale prices indices, which often are used for converting from nominal to real. So if you take the period, the first half, we have this is based on for 23-24 is based on the first advance estimates. It's an advance estimate because the year is actually not over. So we don't have the actual figure. This is the first advance estimates, prediction about what will happen finally for 23-24. For the first half or for the first two quarters of 23-24, we do have, based on actual indicators of the economy, the similar story that nominal GDP is growth is 8.6%, real
Please stay in the meeting. Sir will be joining shortly.
Now it's okay, sir. So please proceed.
Okay. Okay. So, can you just give me an indication as to where you lost me?
Previous slide, sir. Previous slide. Previous one.
Just a moment. There's again some problem in. I'm sorry, but there's some problem in the network. Uh, can you hear me?
So you're audible.
Okay. Let me just uh, use this only to. Okay. So what I was saying was that uh, I should be able to move it now. Okay, so what I was saying was that if we do not have the data for the full year yet, so the 23-24 GDP figure on which the previous table graph was based is the first advance estimate. Okay, it's an advance estimate, but we do have already released data for the first 2 quarters of 23-24. So H1 23-24. So if you take the data for the first 2 years, you see the same phenomena there, that the basis on which the real GDP growth is looking high is an implicit inflation rate which is very low. And that inflation rate is inconsistent with what the consumer price index is showing, and is therefore also inconsistent with the lending rate of the Reserve Bank, the repo rate, okay, which is the interest rate that it targets for inflation control. So the repo rate has been maintained at 6.5% since February 23. That is for the last 1 year, the period in which you're supposedly having this very low inflation rate. So if this inflation rate is correct, why is the repo rate so high? Okay. And if the repo rate is so high, then it means, and the inflation rate is the correct figure, then the real rate of interest will be extremely high. That should have a very dampening effect on growth, but it doesn't seem to be having that. So clearly, there is a problem that essentially the inflation rate that is being used to determine, or the inflation rates that are used to determine what are the real growths of different sectors of the economy, uh, seem to be tracking what has happened to the wholesale price index rather than to the consumer price index. So the high growth that we are supposedly seeing in 23-24 may be a statistical illusion and certainly is not reflecting what is happening the to the real purchasing power of those who uh, of large majority of the population, because for them this consumer price index actually increases, reflecting the increase in prices. And if you look at the food price inflation rates, okay, they are even higher at close to 10%. Okay, so for much of the population, if you tell them you are having real growth and actually no increases in prices, they would laugh because that's not their experience. Okay, so to conclude from this high growth that really incomes in India are generally increasing extremely at a very fast rate would be an inappropriate conclusion to make. Okay, now keeping that in mind, okay, if you now look at where the revenues are coming from for the central government, then that is telling a story. Okay. So what we have when you look at GDP is that in terms of actual growth of the income base of the Indian economy, the post-COVID period has been one of compressed or depressed growth. And even the high growth that you're seeing in the last 1 year is not really significantly high. What you saw as high growth earlier was simply because there was a base effect of a sharp decline in the pandemic year because of the lockdown. And then you have some recovery, which shows very high rates for some time, but that is not really being sustained. And therefore, there is, as far as income growth concerned, a constraining tendency. If so, the question comes, where is the revenue coming from? Okay, and growing at even faster rate than the nominal GDP. Clearly, the base from which those taxes come, the income base from which those taxes come, must have grown faster than overall GDP and overall national income. Only then can you get this trend. And when you look at the taxes, which are the taxes which have been responsible for this growth of revenues, then you see that the two most important are the two direct taxes, corporate tax and income tax. Corporate tax, despite the fact that 2019-20 there was a significant concession given in corporate tax in the background of the slowdown that year, even then you have a 66% increase in corporate tax revenues compared to 2019-20, despite the fact that nominal GDP has grown by only 47%. If you look at personal income tax, there it's even bigger, almost doubling, more than double. The income tax has doubled. GST has also gone up, but not to the same degree, and the gap in the growth of GST relative to gap between the percentage increase in GST plus relative to the overall GDP growth is much narrower and can be explained by GST, by the increasing importance of products or commodities which invite higher GST rates than the others which are lower. Okay, all of these are indicating that the income base from which corporate taxes and income taxes come, they have risen much faster than the overall national income. That their share in the total income of this economy has increased, and therefore they are able to contribute more to the revenues of the government, because nothing has happened in this period to indicate where tax rates have been increased. In fact, effective tax rates to degree have come down. So effective tax rates have not increased in this period. There is no dramatic rise in the number of taxpayers. Okay, so clearly the income base from which corporate taxes and personal income taxes come, which are the corporate profits, which is the base for corporate taxes, and incomes above a certain level, which become liable for income tax. It's those incomes, their share in income must have increased. That's the only way you can explain this. Okay. So if that is the case, so you see, for example, corporate tax and income tax as a percentage of GDP are higher than in 2019-20. So post-COVID, their share in total income has gone up. Corporate profits and incomes of those who pay income tax has gone up. Okay. So that when you say that there's a K-shaped recovery of the economy, meaning that different parts of the economy do not necessarily move in the same direction, the K-shaped recovery, one side of that K-shaped recovery is that segments of the economy, the corporate sector, and relatively higher income groups, their growth of income has been superior to the growth of overall income, and therefore their share of income has actually increased. Okay. Now, you can actually further understand how concentrated this is if you look at actually the base for these taxes. So we always hear about these figures of the large number of people who are paying taxes. This is from income tax data for assessment year 21-22, which is the latest that we have so far. So just to give an illustration, though apart from individuals, HUFs, firms, and other entities are there which also pay personal income tax, while companies pay corporate income tax, individuals constitute the bulk of the income tax payers. So if you look at the individuals, these are figures based on income tax returns filed. So 6.3 crore Indians filed income tax returns in 21-22. Okay. Of those 6.3 crores, almost 4.3 crores did not have incomes high enough to have even 1 rupee contribution of income tax. So their tax liability was zero. Okay. On the other side, of those 6.3 crores, less than half a crore accounted for 84.2% of the total tax liability. Okay. So the income taxes which have grown, they are being paid largely by a group of people who constitute an extremely small share of the Indian population. India's population is about 137 crores now. Okay. Which is divided into at least 30 crore households. So even if you take that in each income tax paying household, there's only one income tax payer. Half a crore households out of 30 crore households accounting for almost 85% of the income tax, which means they account for 85% of the significant part of the taxable income. Okay, because their tax slabs are also higher. So the income base on which you're getting this higher income tax is extremely narrow in terms of its spread within the Indian population. If you similarly look at companies, so 9,65,000 companies filed income tax returns in 21-22, but just 583 out of those 9,65,000 companies accounted for 58% of the income and therefore 58% of the tax liability. Okay. In fact, their share in the profits is a little higher because their effective tax rates are lower. So the corporate income tax base and the personal income tax base is extremely narrow. It's a very small segment of the economy in terms of the relative significance in both the companies as well as in as far as individuals are concerned. So a small stratum of society has achieved significant increase in their share in the total income, and that's the source of higher revenues for the state. Okay. So what you get is that the total income that is available to be distributed in India, the growth of that income, you see effects of the COVID pandemic in producing strong contractionary effects on that income. But that is combined with a process of shifts in the distribution of that income. An already unequal distribution of income becomes even more unequal in this period. So what the COVID pandemic has done is to make, or the effects following from the COVID pandemic and the policy measures have done, is to make India's large majority of Indians who have to work for a living basically adjust to a lower income level, the beneficiaries of which are a relatively small proportion of the Indian population at the top of the income ladder. That is the great reset that has happened. If you see the what underlies this particular trend in if you look at the trends in revenues relative to incomes. Okay, if you look at the other side itself, for example, if you look at employment, okay, and earnings from employment, the PLFS data are suggesting that there's been a significant growth of employment actually. Okay, but if you look at that employment, where that employment has grown, particularly since 2019-20, there is no growth in regular employment. All the employment growth is in self-employment. All the employment growth is in rural India, nothing in urban India. And a significant part of the increase in employment is in agriculture. Okay. And of course, you see as a result of that, an increasing number of women in employment. So are you capturing work that was not being counted as employment, or are you capturing a process of distress employment? Clearly, this is not the employment trends that you would be getting in an economy which is economy that is progressing, which is in an expansionary phase of relatively high growth. You would certainly not be having an employment process where there's a return to agriculture. Okay. So there is clearly distress behind these trends in employments, the details of which can be discussed or worked out. But more importantly, when you look at the earnings from this employment, okay, from the same PLFS data, if you look at the earnings from that employment, so over a 5-year period, the average earnings from this employment have hardly grown. And in the case of wage earnings or even by casual labor, daily wage earnings, the increase in nominal earnings, monthly or daily earnings, is much less than the increase in the price level. So the real incomes of people who are employed have shrunk. And the greatest decline has taken place in precisely that category where the greatest increase in employment has taken place, which is in self-employment. In self-employment, the average earnings per month have actually shrunk. And they've shrunk in such a way that if you take all the self-employed in, say, 2018, and you look at all the self-employed in 2023, the number is significantly greater. But if you take the combined income of all the self-employed, in real terms in 23, it is lower than in 2018. Okay. So clearly, for people who work and have to earn from work, they have not experienced an increase in income. They have in fact experienced a contraction in their income. So both sides of the story, you can see that on the one hand, you have in the form of higher direct tax revenues, reflection of an increase in income at the top. And on the other side, for those who have to work, who make up the majority of the Indian population, despite the growth in employment that the figures seem to show, those same figures are showing that the actual earnings from that employment have shrunk. And therefore, the share in income, in national income, has actually shrunk. So you do find from both sides clear evidence that there has been this great reset of the Indian economy, where the large majority of Indians who have to work, who have low incomes, they have been forced to adjust to a lower level of income because of the pandemic conditions, while the top has actually ended up being the beneficiary of that contraction. So an overall contractionary trend in the economy, coupled with a redistribution in favor of the top. That's the great reset that has happened. That's the opportunity of making an opportunity out of crisis that seems to have happened, which is reflected itself in the revenue position of the government actually be improving compared to even 2019-20. Okay. Now I want to come to this other side. Now, okay, so if you broadly speaking, if one looks at the story, so government's revenues have gone up because a certain section has benefited. But what government has not done is to significantly increase expenditures as a way of redistributing income in favor of the rest, those who are losing out. Okay, it has actually let the expenditures remain within the limits set by what has happened to revenues. But to the extent that revenues have gone up, it has been in a position to step up certain expenditures. But this claim that this has resulted in a significant reorienting of government expenditure, such that government expenditure has become more productive and is leading to greater capital expenditure, so greater investment for the future. That story is a bit of a myth, as this table would make clear. Okay, so students of economics would understand that we make a distinction between public investment and private investment because of the rationale or logic which drives them. And we talk about public investment as something that becomes necessary wherever private investment is not forthcoming. Okay, that's the general understanding. But public investment is public investment whether it is done by government directly or whether it is done by public sector enterprises. So public investment together is the investment done by government plus investment capital expenditure done by public sector enterprises. Okay. So if you look at central public expenditure, so in the budget figures, you also have figures of expenditures through the resources of public enterprises. Okay. Now you can see the period in which this, what in central government accounts appears to be an increase in capital expenditure. In that same period, the expenditure through the resources of public enterprises is moving in the opposite direction. Okay. And resources of public enterprises are taken away by the government in the form of non-tax income, dividends, etc. from public enterprises go to the central government. So the investment through the resources of public enterprises, they have become 50% of the level that they were in 2019-20. Okay. So the central government expenditure increases directly on government account. The investment through public enterprises, on the other hand, declines. Okay. So if you look at the total, that total is only about 30% higher than in 2019-20. And as a percentage of GDP, the total expenditure in 23-24 is lower than in 2019-20. And in fact, in no year after 2019-20 has the share of central government capital expenditure exceeded the level in 2019-20. Okay. Meaning that the actual increase in capital expenditure that they're showing is an accounting story. Okay. Someone wanted to ask something? Okay. So there isn't an actual real increase in capital expenditure that has taken place. It's an accounting story, whether you show it in government account or you show it in public enterprises, from an economic point of view, it makes no difference whether it is one or the other. Okay, depending upon what kind of investment you're doing and what form you. So, one form of expenditure through the budget could take the form of investment in public enterprises, which then invest further. Okay, so it's just a purely accounting thing whether you credit it to government account or you credit it to the public enterprises account, because those public enterprises are legally registered as separate entities with majority government ownership. Okay, but if you look at public investment done by the central government or central enterprises, what in an economic sense is relevant as public investment, there is actually no trend of that expenditure being stepped up. You just simply reduce at one end and increase at the other. In fact, part of the capital expenditure is also slightly inflated because of another reason, which I've discussed previously, that when the COVID pandemic happened and the central government was not able to pay GST compensation cess to the states, okay, it chose to give them loans in lieu of GST compensation cess, but at that time decided that these loans that the central government will give by borrowing itself will not be recorded will not affect the central government's fiscal deficit, because when putting it in the accounts, you net the figure out. There's a loan central government takes, there's a loan central government gives, the net borrowing is zero. So you net it out of the accounts, and then that loan that the central government gives to the states is not treated as part of expenditure. Okay, doesn't appear as part of the total expenditure. But when they stopped that process of that giving loans, they replaced it and increased the loans to states for capital expenditure, which is what they also recorded as part of the capital expenditure on central government account. This particular expenditure was, however, recorded in the account, even though the figure of that loan till date remains lower than the figure of the loans given when they were given in lieu of GST compensation cess. So the actual lending to the states has come down, but in the central government's account, because it is recorded as expenditure, one was recorded as expenditure, the other not, it inflates the figure of capital expenditure, because this loans to state governments for capital expenditures is treated as capital expenditures on central government account. So the process of actual increase that the state public investment has really been stepped up as part of the process of trying to recover from the COVID pandemic, that story is also a bit of a myth, not a reality when you take into account the total story of public investment. However, what the increase in revenues has done is something that becomes clearer if one looks at what was the trend in the past. Okay, so if you were in an economy in which inequality was increasing, okay, where incomes of those who work were relatively stagnant, not growing very rapidly, while per capita income was rising much faster and therefore rising at the top. That has been the story for the last 30 years before the COVID pandemic. What that did was to make despite the fact that governments have been following a policy of fiscal conservatism, keep your taxes low, keep expenditures low, do not let the fiscal deficit become so large. Okay, despite fiscal conservatism, the state, while it has become poorer relative to the rich, has tended to become richer relative to the poor. So the amount that the government has to spend per person, per head of the Indian population, that increases, while the earnings from economic activities of those individuals do not necessarily increase to the same degree. This allows for a certain kind of false politics of redistribution to be played, where the increased in revenues coming from basically increased inequalities allows government to become more important in the sustenance of people because their incomes from economic activities are limited and not growing. The part that can come as support from government of different forms, the weight of that in the total income of people with which they sustain, that can still go on increasing. Okay. This was already a trend that was there before the COVID pandemic. And you could say that part of the way in which the political difficulties that might have arisen from the great reset that I talked about, that part of the political difficulties could be dealt with, or the cutting sharp edge of that political difficulties be blunted by actually utilizing a part of these additional revenues that you are getting because of increased inequality, partially for different kinds of support. So people's incomes have shrunk or they are in distress, but that only allows the state to become even more important in their lives, making use of the gains on the revenue front that they're getting because of the increased inequality. So the contractionary trend in the economy and a significant redistribution of income in favor of the rich, and the implications of that for government revenues and the significance of revenues relative to incomes of people, the relative weight of those revenues, at least for some time, increases, allowing certain kinds of support to be given so that that distress does not go to the point as to create severe political difficulties. That false kind of politics of redistribution is something that this structural reality for some time enables. However, if the contractionary trends in the economy are something that are going to persist, then sooner or later that is going to show up. For some time, you can have a redistribution of a small cake. Okay, but if the cake is not going to grow significantly enough, that process of redistribution also has certain inherent limits. And beyond the point, any such redistribution is likely to confront all kinds of other political difficulties, which it may not be possible to sustain. But for the time being, or temporarily, despite the contractionary trends in the economy, that reset, that change, the mix shift in the distribution of income allows the government to be fiscally comfortable relatively, okay, even if it chooses to divert some expenditure to supporting the people who are in distress, okay. And that is something that is even politically payable in times of distress, and that can, for the time being, blunt the edge of any resistance, political problems that may arise from that particular reset that is happening. That's the reality that the Indian economy is confronting, which is what you see in the so what you do not have is any attempt really of using fiscal policy to address either the problems which are giving rise to contractionary trends in the economy, nor do you have any attempt at redistributing income in favor of the poor. But what you have is a false politics of redistribution, which becomes possible because underlying it is basically a redistribution in favor of the rich rather than a redistribution in favor of the poor. But a redistributive in favor of the poor can be the appearance that it takes because of the fact that there are certain short-term revenue implications for the government of this shift in the distribution of income. So that's the reality of the economy at this point of time, which reflects itself in what has happened to the revenues and expenditures, and in which the process of revenues and expenditures of the government have played their part. But as I said, immediately it is not feeling any pressure, but this is a condition, a context that simply cannot continue unless the fundamental problems addressing affecting the economy and insofar as this increased inequality in distribution is going to further impede the growth of demand and expansion of production in the Indian economy, it's not a viable way of sustaining the Indian economy in the long term. But whether there will be any change on that or not, strategy is something that will, of course, depend partially on what happens in the elections in 2024. So with that, let me conclude. And if you have any questions, then I can take them.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful lecture. Now the floor is open for discussion. Participants can now raise your queries. You may unmute your mic and ask questions or post them in the chat box.
Sir,
Yes.
am I audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Sir, my name is Anjana. I'm the sir scholar of this department.
Okay.
It was pleasure to listen to you, sir. Sir, our finance minister highlighted that, and she announced that a Lakpati Didi scheme for women, and it targeted to 3 crore women from 2 crore women, and a lot of, and he also announced that a lot of schemes for a lot of loans for women to encourage them and to achieve the financial inclusion. So do you think that they have helping out the financial mission of rural women?
Look, actually, it's exactly like what I'm telling you, is that why women are having difficulties in getting employment or economic opportunities has to do with certain macroeconomic realities of the Indian economy. Okay. Now, fiscal policy is a potential instrument of addressing those macroeconomic problems. Okay. And the fundamental macroeconomic problems that the Indian economy is facing is that because of the way income from it is tending to get distributed. Okay. Where you essentially have a situation where large proportion of the population cannot find work. Okay. So they have a perpetual surplus labor situation which acts as a depressing feature on wages and different kinds of other returns to laboring activity. That means any growth that takes place tends to benefit the top. Okay. But it does not create conditions conducive to the top using its income to generate more employment and more expansion of output because of the demand problems that are inherent in that particular context. Okay. Now, what is actually happening is that you do not use fiscal policy to address that fundamental problem. You can address that fundamental problem in 2 related ways. One is if you tax and spend in a manner which transfers effectively income from the top to those who have less. Okay, so you can use fiscal policy to make the distribution of income more egalitarian than the highly unequal distribution that the economy is normally tending to generate. Secondly, what you can do is, if you do that, you can step up spending, which expands demand in the economy, and therefore economic activity grows in response to that. And these processes then generate employment, which expand the opportunities for people. And part of that process also, of course, you may need some special interventions in that process in order to facilitate the entry of more women and strengthening their economic status. But fundamentally, you need that underlying reality to be the basis on which any of these issues are to be addressed. But instead of doing that, okay, you keep taxes low, you keep spending low, but because people have so little, you can go and tell them that, look, I'm doing this for you in order to help you set yourself up. Okay. But that doesn't address the fundamental macroeconomic conditions which are not allowing production and employment to expand. Okay. So, yes, you will give some loans, you will give some money in some schemes. That's the approach that has become the norm, that for every problem, there is a scheme. You give a little bit of money as loan, or you give a little money as grant, or you give some kind of support, and that solves the problem. But you're not addressing the fundamental macroeconomic conditions which underlie that problem. So all these schemes, so therefore it's like, for every problem, there's a scheme. And there's some allocation for every such thing. But those allocations are never going to be enough to address the fundamental macroeconomic constraints, because the total level of that expenditure in the economy itself is too low. So one part of the expenditure, what effect it has, depends also on what it is part of. When you have a big spending program which generates a lot of expansion, employment, then that big spending program, every part of it also has a greater effect. But without addressing, so what you see is true, that you have all these schemes. And that's what I call the false politics of redistribution. So you can go and tell every section, I have this for you, I have that for you, I have given this much amount of money for that. In many cases, it involves an actual transfer of money or loans. So tangible gains appear to be accruing to people from different kinds of government policies, but they are not really addressing the fundamental macroeconomic constraints that are preventing output and employment to grow in India's economy. I hope I made the answer clear.
So, yes.
Anjana? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hmm.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question. I am Meera N, a research scholar at the department.
Yes.
Sir, my question is regarding a claim made in the recently released government document, the Indian Economy, a Review. So in it, the claim has been made that our consumption demand, or our private final consumption expenditure, has been quite resilient. Despite a lot of pandemic-induced shocks. So it is saying that PFCE has emerged as a major growth driver, and its resilience is testament to the fact that economy has weathered shocks well. But to what extent, sir, can we read these numbers as a measure of broad-based percolation of, the income, or broad-based recoveries, as a matter of fact?
Okay. Now, private final consumption expenditure is, of course, an aggregate. Okay. It includes the consumption expenditure of everyone. Whether you have lots of income, money, lots of spending power, or you have little. Okay. But depending upon who is doing the spending, its composition is different. Okay. So part of the so-called resilience of consumption expenditure is basically reflecting that great reset. That some section of the population will spend on several things other than on food. Okay. The difference between large sections of the Indian population and this small minority is that large sections of the Indian population spend a large part of their income on food and other essentials, whereas there are others who can spend on other items. So when you see consumption expenditure showing so-called resilience, it is reflecting what is happening to the spending ability of a certain segment of the population. It is not necessarily reflecting what is happening to everyone else. Okay. So if you see the consumer price index is a index of in which the food necessarily plays an important part. Okay. So the consumer price index is capturing better what is happening to the prices of those commodities which are essential, which large majority of Indians consume. So if you take that consumer price index as the basis, clearly the large majority of Indians are facing a problem of sustaining expenditure. Okay. What is happening is that the beneficiaries of this great reset of in the distribution of income, sections of them have stepped up spending. So if you look at, for example, I mean, I can give you two indicators of this story. So first you look at the sales of automobiles in India. Okay, you have annual figures of automobile sales available up to December 23. Okay, till just about a month ago. Now, if you look at the automobile sales, if you look at the category of passenger cars, you find that the sales now of passenger cars have recovered to levels which are higher than prevailing in 2018-19 or 2019-20. Okay, so more cars are being sold now than were being sold then. There was a dip in between, COVID related, and then it has bounced back. And we also know from other evidence that within the category of cars also, the cars that are being sold are in larger numbers are now. So everyone talks about this shift in the Indian car market from the smaller cars to the bigger cars. Okay, bigger, more expensive cars. So that's reflecting the income status of the population which had cars. Okay, their income status has gone up. They are replacing their smaller cars with bigger cars. But what about those who didn't have? Okay, so you look at the parallel figure of what has happened to the sales of motorcycles in this country. And there you find that motorcycle sales have not recovered. Motorcycle sales even today are lower than they were in 2018-19 and 2019-20. The number of motorcycles being sold. Okay. And if you accept the claim that rural employment has grown significantly, you should have seen, if there was an income effect of that, you should have seen a significant increase in expenditure and purchase of motorcycles. You don't see that. Okay, so you see this divergence within the consumption expenditure. Then if you look at consumer durables production as a whole, if you look at the index of industrial production, if you look at consumer durables, you find that there has been a stagnation in that for more than 10 years. Okay, so why would you get that if you are having people increasing their spending? And most consumer durables have very low penetration in India. Only a small percentage of the population purchases many consumer durables, except for the mobile phone. Nothing else has wide penetration in India. So if that is these trends are indicating that what you're seeing as consumption expenditure resilience is something that is coming from the beneficiaries of an income distribution shift. They are spending their larger share in that income, partly post-COVID, after being locked down and inside. There is some psychological impacts of that, which is inducing people to spend more on various things, travel more, tourist more. But that's only one small part of the population. It is not reflecting itself in the general consumption expenditure of large majority of the population, and it cannot, but they don't have the incomes for that.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I have two queries basically.
Yes.
The first one is related to employment. As you have said, the employment crisis that we are facing. I recently read that even the IAMs are struggling to place the entire batch. So even the top managerial level positions are facing a crisis. So where is this employment crisis leading us to? I'm not sounding pessimistic, but still, are we in a recessionary spiral? And the second one is that, as you have said, the macroeconomic fundamentals are not so smooth, and the lack of data. We don't have, we are not releasing the surveys, and even the census has been delayed.
Yes.
So, is it really affecting the macro, or is it really really covering the real picture of the macroeconomic soundness of the economy?
Yeah. So let me begin with the second, that yes, it is true, and it is becoming an increasing problem that you do not have data that should have been available. So, for example, the consumption expenditure survey, the last one that has been released was 2011-12. Census is also 2011. So there's one problem, which is this, and it is also being, that instead of data being seen as something which has to be accurately reflecting the truth, it's a way of understanding what the truth, reality of the economy is, so that appropriate interventions to address problems can be worked out. That's the reason why we generate data. Otherwise, what is the use of any data? Okay. So that our approach, however, is changing to one in which the reality of the economy, if it cannot be revealed, that seems to be better. The political establishment seems to be working in such a direction. Therefore, you have interference in the data generation process, and part of its effect has been that certain data is simply not being generated. Consumption expenditure survey was done, the data was not released. Government decided that there was a methodological problem with it, and therefore the data will never be released. Which is odd, because it's for experts to figure out whether, and you can always release data saying these are the problems with that data, and experts can assess what they can get from that data. But it was simply put into cold storage. It is not going to be released. We know that there have been problems with questions of the NFHS data. There are problems. The census has not been allowed, even though the COVID pandemic is conditions which would have prevented or delayed the census have been long past. But that census has also not been permitted. We don't have any accurate estimate of how many people died in this country during COVID. That also is missing. So all studies indicate that Kerala did better in terms of managing COVID than the rest of India. But according to official figures, more people per head of population died in Kerala than elsewhere. That's because you don't have any real figures. Everyone else says really the difference between Kerala's official figures and actual deaths is the narrowest. So therefore, that's why you see Kerala's official deaths are higher than in the rest of the country. But you don't have any. So when the WHO came up with an estimate, all that the government said was, this is wrong. There's a problem with it. But no attempt been made to actually generate any independent estimate of what really what happened. So there is a problem now we are increasingly facing of data, but I think that whatever data is available, even that is still managing to tell a story. How long it will be there possible, we don't know. But so far, we can still, despite the limitations of data, do all the data, for example, I presented, none of it is my creation. It is still official data. So there's still something in the Indian statistical system which allows some things to come out. Whether that will sustain or not, we don't know. But so far, while there are limitations of data and there are points beyond which you're not able to go in capturing that reality, no matter what is done. So, for example, if you look at the PLFS data. So, if you look at the PLFS data, on the face of it, it looks as there's a lot of growth of employment. Okay. And that sounds very good. that fits in with the narrative of the Indian economy doing very well. But that same PLFS data is also telling you where that employment is increasing, what has happened to earnings. So that's also something you can see in that particular data. And then the picture of increased employment looks a little different than what it seems at first sight. So there's still a lot of data that is available which allows you to capture relatively accurately what is happening in the economy. So that if some people choose to have a different narrative, then that's a matter of their interpretation or their choice. It's not really because the data is not allowing you to arrive at. And where the data is a problem, you can also clearly indicate what that problem is. Now, coming to the employment question, yes, that's really the big problem for the India's economy, is that you are caught in a vicious circle where, because large proportion of the population is unemployed or cannot find work, you are fixing a significant section of the population at a relatively low level of income. Economic circumstances simply do not permit an significant increase in the returns to laboring activity. Okay, and since that's the majority of the Indian population, that means they are not able to constitute or provide an expanding market for production. Because they cannot provide an expanding market for production, even investment to expand that production gets adversely affected. We are having a continuous decline in India's investment ratio also at the moment. So because of that, employment doesn't get created, and the same cycle is continuously being repeated. Okay, so that is the fundamental problem, and if you have to break that cycle, as I was saying, fiscal policy is an important instrument of breaking that cycle, provided you use it to redistribute income in favor of the people who work, and you use it to step up spending, which has a positive effect on aggregate demand in the economy. Neither of that is actually happening, and if that doesn't happen, then you end up in a situation where this situation is continuously not only repeating itself, but the crisis is in many ways becoming graver. So if you look at the data I showed you, the real growth is not just low, it is continuously coming down. And if the real growth is coming down, there's no way employment can increase. As it is, we have a long-term problem, which is, if you look at the last 30 years, food prices have grown faster than the prices of manufactured products. In case of many manufactured products, you've had a process of cheapening. So in all sectors of the economy, there is so even if food prices keep going up and grow up fast, then even if real wages remain stagnant, okay, then what you have to pay for that wage, money terms, goes on increasing because of the increase in food prices. So a worker who has to be allowed to at least provide the minimum amount of food has to be paid a certain sum. That sum goes on increasing because prices are increasing. On the other hand, you have machines of different kinds that are available which can substitute for that worker, whose prices are coming down because of cheapening of capital goods, because of technological improvements globally. It's a trend that you have those things becoming cheaper. So what you get is a tendency in all sectors of the economy to replace labor with capital goods or the machines. That tendency is aggravating the problem already of employment. So you already had that particular trend, and with that, this macroeconomic situation, it's like it's one of the most serious crises that you can think of. Of course, it appears differently in different parts of the country because much of the India's unemployed surplus labor is geographically concentrated in some regions of the country. But from the economy also, and this tendency for machines to replace labor now is also affecting employments which in an earlier period grew. Okay, so the increased use of technology in production initially increases certain kind of employment, while other kind of relatively unskilled employment comes down. So certain kind of skilled employment goes up as part of that process. But now with AI and everything, even that is changing. So even the skilled employments of which were growing in the past, their growth will start slowing down. And that and the overall macroeconomic scenario is what is being reflected in what you're seeing, is that even the IIM is having difficulty because we've had a significant expansion of higher education in India in response to demand coming from the population because of the fact that they feel that only an education can give them access to a job with a reasonable income. So whether through private education or public education, people have been trying to secure a higher education degree, but their numbers have become very large relative to the employment that is available. So there, that category also you're seeing now a rising problem of unemployment.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I am Pradeep Kumar from Maharajas College.
Yes, Pradeep.
Sir, I think there is a worry that the public or investment in India has been moving down over the years. You know that in 2008, the investment as a percentage of GDP was as high as 35.6%.
Yes.
But since 2014, it has been going down. But the
Yes.
government claims that the reason for decline in investment is the risk aversion policies of the financial institutions. You might have noticed in the economic review
Yes.
that the boom in investment is attributed to unsustainable credit situation, whereas the decline in investment is attributed to risk aversion policies of the financial institutions. To what extent it is justifiable?
Okay, so like several other things, there is some factual correlation with these claims, but correlation does not necessarily imply causation, and it is important to also understand the direction of the causation. Okay, so for example, if you have lending and that lending leads to investment, and that investment does generate a return, then there's no problem that arises that people are not able to repay their borrowing that they have done. The requirement is that the investment must be able to generate a return. So if that credit expansion in the period before 2008 led to a problem of banks being saddled with non-performing assets, eventually start showing up from 2013-14, then the question is why? Why did those investments turn bad? Why did they not generate the returns which would allow the borrowers to be able to service their debt? Okay. So if you say that the problem was because the credit was given, then you're saying that the investment opportunities didn't exist. If investment opportunities didn't exist and people still invested, okay, they were mad for some time, but in the process of correcting it, that means you don't have investment opportunities which would pay. Then you can't turn around and say that now because banks are risk averse, therefore people are not being able to invest. Okay. So if you and if you look at the question of investment is not constrained by finances. Investment is constrained by the fact that there aren't enough returns. Okay. If you make investments, you are going to produce something which has to be sold. So if you look at that boom up to 2008, when there was an investment boom, where was that investment happening? So one investment was basically households acquiring more property. Construction. Household real estate was one sphere where construction expenditure was increasing. That was one part of the boom. A second area where you had significant investment taking place was in manufacturing. Okay. Now in manufacturing, that was required. That meant also an increase in the capacity of manufacturing. And the third sector of investment was important sector was other kinds of infrastructure projects, which also led to increase in construction activity. Now, what all of these investments in turn did, that all of them were also creating demand for manufactured products. Because when you're having construction, you're buying cement, you're buying steel, you're buying other things, they were creating demand for manufactured products. When manufacturing sector was expanding its capacity, it was creating demand for different kinds of capital goods itself. Okay, so you had a process where demand was being generated by that very same process of expenditure. But the problem for that sustainability lay in the fact that the capacities that were being created at a much faster pace than the demand that could sustain it, because of the fact that other components of that demand were simply not keeping pace. So consumption demand wasn't keeping pace because so many people were being left behind as far as income was concerned. India was exporting, but as it was increasing its production, it was also importing more. So in trade also, you had a net loss of market rather than a gain of market. Public expenditure was being kept under hold, so that was also not increasing the demand so much. So eventually that process reaches a point at which the investment process outstrips that demand. And that's what leads to that particular collapse. Now, when that collapse happens, naturally, of course, that collapse of investment itself has a feedback effect. If that investment process has stopped or got stalled, then the demand that it was generating also disappears. So it aggravates that demand problem. And that then shows up in the form of those who had borrowed to make investments not being able to repay that. Okay. So what is called the so-called twin balance sheet problem can be as much a effect, okay, as it can be a cause. Now, if you don't want to recognize that there is a demand problem, if you rule that out because your perspective is a supply side perspective, then you think that the only problems are on one side, okay. So that banks have become risk-averse. Banks have become risk-averse, but government can't make banks to step up credit with such a large public sector in the banking system. Government has done so many things to try and release animal spirits of private investors. Ease of doing business, make in India, this, that, so many schemes, all designed to encourage, now PLFI, to encourage private investment. But it has simply not picked up because you are addressing the problem on the wrong side of the equation. The problem is the problem of demand. If the demand conditions were robust, private firms would have found the resources to make that investment. They would not have let that opportunity go by. The reason that investment is not happening is that you have a severe demand problem. And you are looking at the effects of it as the cause. And if those effects were the real cause, then the cleaning up of the balance sheets of banks and companies through IBC, etc., and all of that should have led to now a stepping up of investment. But it's not happening. Still not happening. Okay. So, and it is actually something to think about. That is now almost 1.5 decades that the investment story, the investment picture in India has been so tepid. And the investment ratio has been on the decline. It's 1.5 decades. How long do you need this process to continue to convince you that you've not got the diagnosis right. You're trying to treat that problem for so long with certain treatment methods. It's not working. But you're still convinced that your treatment method is the one. And anyone says that the problem is really on the demand side, I don't accept it. That's the approach. So the analysis of the problem has remained the same over the 15 years that you've seen this problem. And the treatment is also that is sought to be given is the same. More and more of that treatment is being given to no effect, to no avail. The investment thing is simply not picking up. Okay. But it's like, I would describe it as like a process of continuously digging yourself into a hole because of an expectation that somewhere down the line you're going to strike gold. You keep digging yourself deeper and deeper into a hole, thinking that at some point of time you're going to find the gold. That seems to be the situation at the moment, that the attempt is to, you're continuously digging yourself into that hole, thinking that at some point there will be something that will allow this investment story to actually pick up. But there's no sign of that happening. And the reason why nothing is happening is that the diagnosis itself is incorrect, which is the one you are referring to. Okay, so the twin balance sheet is the problem. That's partially at least an effect rather than a cause of the problem of investment.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Everybody must be wanting to go for dinner now.
If there are no further questions, we can move on to the vote of thanks. I call upon Vani M. Nambiar, first MA Economics, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, one and all. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, listening to Professor Surajit Mazumdar decoding the Union Budget 2024. Undoubtedly, sir has been able to take us through the intricacies of the budget in a very lucid manner. Sir has also been able to provide us a crystal clear insight on the budget highlights through a detailed illustrationary presentation on the expenditure and receipts patterns of the central government over time, which actually given us a way more clearer picture of the same. Those valuable perceptions that Sir has shared on changing trends in growth and inflation in India, specifically on the employment status, has been very educating when it comes to comparing a pre to post-COVID Indian economy. Those critical insights on the union budgets from varying dimensions were really illuminating, especially for the students of economics. On behalf of the department, I express my profound gratitude to Professor Surajit Mazumdar, who despite his numerous and rather tight schedule, has found time to grace a session at its best. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to thank Dr. Shrija SR, Head of the Department of Economics, University of Kerala, for organizing this very informative session, from which I believe we all have profited with a lot of insights. Thank you so much, ma'am. A word of gratitude to all faculties, research scholars, and students for their participation and keen listening in this session. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much, sir, once again, and wishing you an all peaceful night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shija.